There is a map of the Horn of Africa, 2 countries, 2 borders, 1 disputed region between them. That disputed region, a vast semi-arid plateau called the Ogaden, has been at the center of one of Africa's most consequential conflicts. A conflict rooted not in ancient hatred, but in decisions made by colonial powers thousands of miles away. A conflict shaped by the Cold War, by superpower calculations that treated African lives as pieces on a global chessboard. A conflict whose consequences, the destabilization of Somalia, the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, the reshaping of the entire Horn of Africa, are still being felt today. This is the story of the Ogaden War. And to understand it, you have to go back to the beginning. If you are new here, this is Untold Africa. Every week we tell one African story that history forgot. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss one. The present conflict stems from the Ethiopian Empire's expansions into the Somali inhabited Ogaden region during the late 19th century. There is no evidence that Ethiopia controlled any Somali inhabited territory prior to Emperor Menelik's expansions to the south and southeast in the late 1880s. This is the starting point. Before the late 19th century, the Ogaden Plateau was inhabited by Somali clans who had lived there for generations. It was not part of any Ethiopian administrative structure. Then came the scramble for Africa. The period in which European colonial powers divided the African continent among themselves, drawing borders with little regard for the people who lived there. The eventual demarcation of boundaries between Ethiopia and the European colonial powers imposed an artificial separation between closely related Somali peoples, who never recognized the authority of the colonizers. The Ogaden was placed under Ethiopian sovereignty, but the people living there remained, ethnically, culturally, and linguistically, Somali. Following World War II, when Ethiopia had been aligned with the Allies against the Axis powers, Great Britain relinquished its claim on the Hod and Ogaden regions. Britain included a clause that the Somali residents would retain their autonomy, but Ethiopia immediately claimed sovereignty over the area. This decision, made in 1948, would define the next half-century of Horn of Africa history. This prompted an unsuccessful bid by Britain in 1956 to buy back the Somali lands it had turned over. Disgruntlement with the 1948 decision led to repeated attempts by Somali parties to reunite the ceded Ogaden with the other Somali territories. A border had been drawn. A grievance had been created, and it would not go away. When Somalia gained independence in 1960, it inherited both a flag and an aspiration. The Somali flag features a 5-pointed star, and 3 of the points represent ethnically and historically Somali territories that it wished to reclaim. The Ogaden was one of these. The 2 others were Djibouti and the Northern Frontier District in Kenya. The concept was called Greater Somalia, the unification of all Somali inhabited territories under one nation. Somalia, a country fractured by the scramble for Africa, was driven by this concept. Ethiopia, a country that fought fiercely to resist colonization, resisted by any means necessary to secure its sovereignty over the Ogaden. Both positions were rooted in legitimate historical arguments. Somalia argued that the Ogaden's Somali population had the right to self-determination. Ethiopia argued that its borders, recognized internationally, were sovereign and inviolable. These 2 positions were incompatible, and in the years following Somali independence, tensions along the border escalated repeatedly. Soon after the Somali Republic became independent, it was on the verge of full-scale war over the Ogaden issue with the Ethiopian Empire, particularly in 1961, and again in the border war of 1964. In a bid to control the population of the region during the 1963 Ogaden Revolt, an Ethiopian Imperial Army division torched Somali villages and carried out mass killings of livestock. Watering holes were machine-gunned by aircraft in order to control the nomadic Somalis by denying them access to water. Thousands of residents were driven out from the Ogaden into Somalia as refugees. By the late 1960s, the Horn of Africa was a region of deep unresolved tension, and the Cold War was about to make everything far more complicated. If you are finding this story as important as we do, take a second to like this video. It helps Untold Africa reach more people who need to hear these stories. What began as a local conflict in a far-flung region of the world grew into a Cold War hotspot as the United States and the Soviet Union took sides. The Somalis had accepted Soviet aid in 1962 when their army began to be trained and equipped by the Soviet Union. General Mohammed Siad Barre became president in 1969 via a military coup, and the Soviets increased their aid program. The Soviet Union and Somalia signed a friendship treaty in 1974. Meanwhile, in Ethiopia, the United States had supported the long-ruling Emperor Haile Selassie. However, after Mengistu Haile Mariam had his rivals killed and became the dominant leader of Ethiopia, the revolution took a communist turn, and he reached out to the Soviet Union to replace United States military aid. The Soviet Union now found itself arming both sides of a potential conflict. The Soviet Union hoped that Ethiopia and Somalia could form a communist federation. However, Siad Barre had designs on the Ogaden region of Ethiopia and resented the growing closeness between Ethiopia and the Soviet Union. In response, the Somali leader reached out to the United States in hopes of securing military aid and eventually expelled the Soviets from the country. The alliances had flipped completely. Somalia, once Soviet-backed, was now seeking American support. Ethiopia, once American-backed, was now Soviet-aligned. Two African nations had become proxies in a global ideological struggle, and the stage was set for war. In July 1977, Somalia made its move. The Somali National Army of 35,000, aided by 15,000 WSLF militiamen, invaded Ethiopia's Ogaden region. The Somali army had superior artillery and air force because of earlier Soviet military aid. The advance was rapid. By late summer of 1977, Somali forces had captured the majority of the Ogaden, including the strategically important towns of Jijiga and the approaches to Harar and Dire Dawa. Ethiopia appeared on the verge of losing a vast portion of its territory. But then, the Cold War intervened again. The Soviet Union withdrew its support for Somalia and backed Ethiopia instead. Ethiopia was saved from defeat through a massive airlift of military supplies worth $1 billion, the arrival of more than 12,000 Cuban soldiers and airmen, and 1,500 Soviet advisors. The scale of this intervention was extraordinary. The Ethiopian-Cuban force, equipped with 300 tanks, 156 artillery pieces, and 46 combat aircraft, prevailed at Harar and Jijiga and began to push the Somalis systematically out of the Ogaden. The tide had turned completely. Somalia, which had advanced so rapidly, now faced a force far beyond anything it could counter. On the 23rd of March 1978, the Ethiopian government declared that the last border post had been regained, thus ending the war. Almost a third of the regular Somali National Army soldiers, 3/8 of the armored units, and half of the Somali Air Force had been lost during the war. The Ogaden War lasted less than 9 months. Its consequences would last decades. Beyond the military statistics, the Ogaden War left a profound human mark on the region. After the war, an estimated 800,000 people crossed the border into Somalia, where they would be displaced as refugees for the next 15 years. At the end of 1978, the first major outflow of refugees, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, headed for Somalia, and were bombed and strafed during the exodus. Around half of the population in the Ogaden were displaced. Some diplomats referred to the depopulation in the Ogaden as a genocide. Artificial droughts and famine were induced to break down Somali opposition to Ethiopian rule in the Ogaden. The region was rendered a vast military zone with indiscriminate aerial bombardments and forced resettlement programs. For the people of the Ogaden, the end of the war did not mean the end of suffering. The conflict that had been presented to the world as a border dispute between two states was experienced by the people of the Ogaden as something far more personal. Their homes, their land, their way of life, caught between two governments and two superpowers, neither of which ultimately represented their interests. The Ogaden War did not end with the last shot fired in March 1978. Its consequences rippled outward, reshaping both nations and the entire Horn of Africa in ways that are still visible today. For Somalia, the defeat was catastrophic. Somalia faced economic ruin and political instability, leading to the eventual overthrow of Siad Barre in 1991. The conflict laid the groundwork for ongoing strife, contributing to a legacy of instability in Somalia that persists today. The war left Somalia with a disorganized and demoralized army. These conditions led to a revolt, which eventually spiraled into the ongoing Somali civil war. For Ethiopia, the victory reinforced the principle of territorial integrity, but did not resolve the underlying tensions in the Ogaden. For the broader region, the war demonstrated how Cold War superpower competition could transform local disputes into devastating conflicts, and how ordinary African people paid the price for decisions made in Moscow and Washington. Today, the borders drawn in the colonial era remain unchanged. The Ogaden, now officially called the Somali region of Ethiopia, remains home to millions of ethnic Somalis. The questions that drove the conflict of 1977 about self-determination, about borders, about belonging, have not been fully resolved. They have simply been set aside. For now. The Ogaden War was not simply a territorial dispute between two neighboring countries. It was the product of colonial borders that divided people who shared a language, a culture, and a way of life. It was shaped by Cold War powers that saw Africa as a theater for their own global competition. And it left behind a human legacy of displacement, of instability, of unresolved questions that the Horn of Africa continues to navigate today. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding how the world we live in came to be, and why, in the Horn of Africa and across the continent, the decisions made by others, in other centuries, in other capitals, still echo today. This was the Ogaden War, and this was Untold. Every week on Untold Africa, we tell one story that history forgot. Ancient cities, lost empires, wars that shaped continents. If this episode helped you understand the Horn of Africa better, subscribe now. Leave a comment telling us which African story you want us to cover next, and share this video with someone who needs to understand where this part of the world comes from. Because history is never just the past. See you next week.